Hello, this is Terence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum. It was a good week for France and the UK. All parties left of center formed a united front in France to turn back the National Rally. Far-right authoritarians who had won a majority of primaries and were expected to do the same in the final vote. UK voters gave a resounding parliamentary majority to Labour, ending the Tories' 14 years of neoliberal austerity and Brexit. I found it a sad couple of weeks in the U.S. The Supreme Court disabled the ability of the executive branch to do good with regard to health, safety, nature, finance, while granting the executive immunity to do evil. And Biden, his debate performance, the hiding his team has been doing, in essence deceiving us all for months, and his inappropriate and inadequate response of denial and defiance. It all shows great disrespect for the American people. Whether anyone else could do better versus Trump may be open to question, maybe. But Biden and his team owe it to us to seriously ask what's best for our country and the world for the next 4 months and the next 4 years. Ezra Klein reminds us, there was no vote Ruth Bader Ginsburg cast and no decision she authored that was as consequential as her decision not to retire. And so, as I did last week with my conversation with Joey Schlanger about her book, The Light Eaters, about how discoveries we're making of intelligence in plants is challenging our understanding of life on Earth. So, from the archives this week, 2 more conversations about the big picture. 20 years ago this week, the United States Postal Service released a stamp honoring inventor and multi-hyphenate visionary Buckminster Fuller. To celebrate that, I recorded a half-hour conversation about the man and his work, July 12, 2004, with his daughter Allegra Fuller Snyder. The Buckminster Fuller Institute is at bfi.org. So you'll hear that first. And in the second half, my 2008 conversation with MacArthur Award-winning evolutionary biologist Stuart Kaufman about his book Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. This is one of my all-time favorites. We get rather excited as we work our way toward his notion that the universe's ceaseless creativity may be the best way to think about God. And you can learn more at StuartKaufFman.com. StuartKauffman.com. Thank you for joining us on Free Forum. Those of you who've heard this show before may recall that I always describe it this way. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, and the ideas of individuals that I suspect hold pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Today, we celebrate a man who embodied those ideas and those ideals. July 12th of this year, the U.S. Postal Service introduced a postage stamp commemorating the life and the work of Buckminster Fuller. Fuller died in 1983 at the age of 88. And my guest today will be his daughter, Allegra Fuller Snyder. The stamp artwork is a painting of Fuller, which originally appeared on the cover of Time magazine in January of '64, and it depicts Fuller's head in the pattern of his most famous invention, the geodesic dome. Now I'm going to give you a little quick biography of Fuller. He was born in Milton, Mass. in 1895, Richard Buckminster Fuller. His family, a New England family, was noted for strong individualists, activists, folks involved in public service. Twice dismissed from Harvard, he served in the Navy from 1917 to 1919, where he invented a winch for rescue boats that could pull airplanes out of the ocean in time to save the lives of pilots. And because of that invention, he was nominated to receive training at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he further developed his abilities. His lifelong interests included using technology to revolutionize construction and improve housing. He designed something called the Dymaxion House, an inexpensive, mass-produced home that could be airlifted to its location. A Dymaxion car, a streamlined, 3-wheeled automobile that could make extraordinarily sharp turns. A compact, prefabricated, easily installed Dymaxion bathroom, Dymaxion deployment units, mass-produced houses based on circular grain bins used by the military. The word Dymaxion, which would now be, I guess, Fuller's brand, as geodesic became as well, was based on the words dynamic maximum ion, and it was actually coined by store advertisers at the time and trademarked it his name. In 1927, Fuller made a now prophetic sketch of the total Earth, which depicted his concept for transporting cargo by air over the pole to Europe. He entitled the sketch A One-Town World. Now, I just want you to note some of the dates of these things. That was 1927. In 1946, Fuller received a patent for another breakthrough invention, the Dymaxion map, which depicted the entire planet on a single flat map without the visible distortion of the shapes and sizes of the continents, which the usual projections involved. After 1947, the geodesic dome dominated his life and career. Lightweight, cost-effective, easy to assemble. Geodesic domes enclose more space without intrusive supporting columns than any other structure. They efficiently distribute the stress. They can withstand extremely harsh conditions. And they're based on Fuller's own synergetic geometry. Beginning in the late 60s, Fuller was especially involved in creating World Game, a large-scale simulation and workshops he designed that used a Dymaxion map to help humanity better understand, benefit from, and more efficiently utilize the world's resources. As he said, we had enough to go around for everyone, and I think that would still be true even with the growth of population since that time. But economics and politics get in the way, and World Game was a way of, if we played to win as a total humanity, how could we get around the obstacles currently introduced by politics and economics? After being spurned in his early career by the architecture and construction establishments, he was later recognized with many major architectural, scientific, industrial design awards. He received 47 honorary doctorates, and in 1983, shortly before his death, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, with a citation acknowledging his contributions as a geometrician, educator, and architect-designer, benchmarks of accomplishment in their fields. My guest today, Allegra Fuller-Snyder, is Professor Emerita of Dance and former director of the pioneering graduate program in dance ethnology at UCLA. Her work has included field observation among American Indian tribes, research in Africa and Asia. She's directed a number of films on dance, served as core consultant for Dancing, an 8-hour series for PBS, and she's chairperson of the board of directors of the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and that website is www.bfi.org, where you can learn much more about the life and work of Buckminster Fuller. This interview is taking place on July 27th, 2004. That was a long one. Welcome, Allegra Fuller-Snyder, to KPFK and Freeforum.
Thank you, Terry.
Though we're going to concentrate on your father, I always want listeners to get to know the people that are on the air here, besides the ideas in their work. So if you could share with listeners how your own path and your own work in dance is related to your father and his work, and if there are some mutual influences there, so that we get to know you, and maybe then we'll focus even more on Bucky.
Much of my being is very directly influenced by my father, who was a very powerful father in a very important way. I always think of my father perhaps essentially as a great teacher, and a great teacher sees the opportunity to teach at every moment. And he had a particular feeling, actually, about children. He felt we were all born geniuses, and we were de-geniused, unfortunately, much of the time by our own educational process. So he was very generous in sharing himself with me, and I felt very much a part of really what he was doing, even though it was fascinating and it didn't quite look like what other parents necessarily were doing, but it certainly felt real and very important to me.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because this was a question I was going to ask later, but I'm going to lay it in now, given what you've just said. I will say to listeners that I actually have known about Buckminster Fuller for many years. I did a documentary on a World Game Workshop in 1973, and I actually wrote a treatment for a life story for television. And one of the moments that was crucial when I looked at his life, was a moment, I believe, in 27 or 25, when he'd had a business failure. He was feeling like he didn't fit in. He wasn't making it for his family. And according to the story I know, and this is what I'm going to ask you about, he stood on a bridge in Chicago and contemplated suicide, and came out of that with the decision that he would live for universe, as I saw it written, rather than for himself. I wondered at the time even what it would be like to be the young child of someone who is living for universe, if you know what I mean. That would they still be there for the little one in the microscopic world of their own family?
Well, that was the critical moment in his life. It did happen in 1927, and I was on the way at that point, and I think a part of this tremendous challenge that he confronted himself with was the fact that he was about to have another child. They had had a daughter before who died at the age of 4. I think my father felt that his own life decisions may have affected that situation, and her death, I think it was it put an extraordinary challenge in front of my father. So it was not on a bridge, but it was on the edge of Lake Michigan, quite close to where we lived for about 2 years after that. And it's interesting that you bring this up, Terry, because it sort of leads me back to the question you posed beforehand. He said that as a human being, he didn't really have the right to take his own life because he had had so many rich experiences, and that he was the custodian of those rich experiences, and that it really wasn't up to him to waste all of that experience. So that this whole theme of experience, which then came to be one of the things that was critical in what he taught me.
Okay, I want to tell people that you're listening to Freeform. I'm Terry McNally, and I'm speaking with Allegra Snyder. She is the daughter of Buckminster Fuller. He is the architect, inventor, philosopher, poet that we're talking about today. She is the Professor Emerita of Dance, former director of the graduate program in dance ethnology at UCLA, and chairperson of the board of directors of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. You can learn a great deal more about the work of Bucky Fuller at www.bfi.org. Okay, experience.
Well, you asked me what was the connection about my own work, which is the study of dance. Like many, many children, dance was really one of my most powerful forms of learning and knowing. I was fortunate, again, one of the things that my father and my mother was also a very important person in my life, certainly, and a very important person in her own right, but they sought out educational situations that really encouraged the whole of a human being to grow, and went to a school in New York called Dalton School, where performance was very much of a part of the learning teaching process. Anyway, dance is the essential, really, understanding and recognition of experience. It is such a deep sense that it doesn't have to take the route that for many others it does, which is then to come into the verbal.
Let me just say, I don't mean to interrupt, but I have begun myself to dance a lot over the last couple of years, and the thing that I have found was that, of course, we danced as human beings long before we could speak. We had to express ourselves, and we expressed ourselves through dance long before language ever emerged.
Well, it is really a very fundamental part of culture, and we could do another program, Terry, on talking about what has happened to it in our own culture. Let's get back to Daddy. So one of his most fundamental sort of mandates to himself was that he had to build his knowledge on direct experience. Now, he recognized that in reading somebody else, and if he really felt they were talking from their own direct experience, that if it coincided enough with his own experience, then he was able to utilize that knowledge as well. But he felt that one of the most destructive elements of culture, in a sense, was that building our own lives on the hearsay of others and not examining and re-examining and basing it on direct experience. So I wrote an article once which has been published a couple of places called Experience and Experiencing. And that was the real link between my work and my father's work, even though it looks quite different. I think we both felt that we were very much coming from the same place in our own concerns and investigation. And he was very supportive of my taking that direction. We probably shouldn't get off on it, but it was interesting. I had sort of a natural gift, which unfortunately I think I lost me completely at this point in math. And I came out of high school and I was thinking about going to college, and Daddy said, "Have you thought about MIT?" And I hadn't thought anything about MIT at all. He said, "Please, would you just apply?" And quite to my surprise, I had, at his encouragement, taken trigonometry and spherical geometry in last years of high school, and so did very well on them. And I got accepted. Now, this isn't this would have been 1945, so there weren't a lot of women getting accepted at MIT at that point. And I thought for a little bit about it. I'm sure it was not just days, but probably weeks. And then I said, "Daddy, really, I think dancing is my way of knowing." And that topic never came up again. He never said, "You'll regret this, my dear," and so forth and so on. He wasn't that way. So anyway, that's our link to our early beginnings.
Right. One of the things I've read the article that you referred to on experience and experiencing, and one of the things you point out there is that he said you have to know things yourself, and you really got the sense that when he even thought, when he conceived, when he was also involving his whole body in it. And I know he, at one point, sets out to not accept even mathematics as it's been passed down, but he wants to have his own empirical understanding of mathematics, and that's some of what led to his own geometry and his own discoveries and so on.
Just one more example in a very different place, Terry. If anybody goes into my father's writings, first of all, he wrote a book called No More Secondhand God. And one of his, what he called his real exercises was each night, as he was a very spiritual person. He would review the Lord's Prayer, and based on his experience of that moment, would say how he would say the Lord's Prayer and understand what its meaning was to himself at that particular moment. And there are some quite few records of the various writings of the Lord's Prayer over periods of time. But so that's an exercise in really acknowledging the direct, and that means the direct experience. That is the experience you might have had that very day, and how that might have changed that word that you'd always thought you understood completely, and then re-examined yet again in light of this new level of experience. So,
thank you for adding that. Let me ask you one other question. If people hear the show and think mostly, oh, he was an architect or he was a designer, or it's really he was, his intelligence was omnivorous.
He actually never liked any of those labels. He called himself, and this will scare all of your listeners, but don't be too frightened, comprehensive, anticipatory. Now really listen with your own experience to these words, because it's very important. Comprehensive, anticipatory, design, scientist. And I've always felt that's exactly what he was. more than that, that's what he hoped that we would all be in our own way, because if you call yourself a design scientist, it gives you all of the leeway to think between that which is yourself as a scientist, a tester, or this or that, and somebody who at the same time allows their mind and imagination to really inspire them.
Mm-hmm. That in some sense, all of us are the design scientists of our own life, of our own choices about work, relationship, spirit, and especially, let's say, work. That's our job, is to design a life. You're listening to Free Forum, and I'm Terry McNally speaking with Allegra Fuller-Snyder, daughter of comprehensive, anticipatory design scientist Buckminster Fuller. And Allegra was the former director of the pioneering graduate program in dance ethnology at UCLA, a field that she was one of the creators of, and she is currently the chairperson of the board of directors of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Fuller died in '83, and a stamp, a U.S. postage stamp commemorating him and his life, was released earlier in July of this year. He was the author of many books, as well as the inventor of many inventions, but some of the books are Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, No More Secondhand God, Critical Path, and the website of the Buckminster Fuller Institute is www.bfi.org. We've talked really about his worldview, his view about experiencing, learning, life, design, and so on. What do you think were his most important contributions, and were they material contributions?
That's a very interesting question, Terry, because the first answer on many people's lips, and I think this is one of the things that makes the stamp so readable, is you see this giant geodesic dome. And certainly, if you speak to a person who has just a smattering of knowledge about Bucky, the first thing they would say, oh, he's the inventor of the geodesic dome. What I love about that stamp is that the geodesic dome is his mind, and it's really his mind and all the directions that I think were, for anybody who did encounter or will encounter his work, will discover that it's really, it moves in so many directions. Now, he would...
Let me cut in for 1 second. For those of you who didn't hear the very top of the show, the stamp, which you can pick up at your local post office, is a copy of a 1964 Time magazine cover of Bucky, which was his bald head, his face, but designed as, illustrated as a geodesic dome.
Right,
Yeah.
with a lot of other, what most people call his inventions, and he again would call tools, which is a very important way of understanding them. He never invented something just to invent it. He recognized that there was a challenge or a problem, and that there was a tool out there. One of the things that he said was one of the great gifts of man was him as a tool maker. That was really made the distinction between man and other species, was his ability to tool make, and I think he felt that that was a critical function of mankind, to continue to be tool makers, and that tools could be anything, but it's always the extension to do a better job of a task that one sees has to be taken care of.
You were saying again in terms of his greatest contributions.
So, my father would say, and I think there are a lot of people out there now who would support this, that it was actually synergetics, which he, there's a book on synergetics, which he called The Geometry of Thinking, And it is really a re-examination of the what he understood to be the building principles of nature, and that it took us into a very different direction than existing geometries took us. And it was obviously at root then of why the geodesic dome looks like the geodesic dome, because it's, again, to make the distinction between Bucky, who was not an architect, I mean, he didn't set out to do that building and design that. He discovered or rediscovered that way of structuring things, so that his work was rediscoveries of what he felt were basic principles.
Right, so the principle he discovered in existence, in nature, and then what the dome is a human fabricated application of the discovery of those principles, which he'd found, if I'm not mistaken, in inside the body, in dandelions, etc.
Yeah, and it's very interesting and exciting to me that I think it was about 2 years after my father died, there was the announcement of the discovery of the Buckminster Fullerine, or the buckyball, and that it was given that name because the chemists and physicists who made this discovery, which later turned out to be such a fundamental discovery that they received the Nobel Prize for that, but that they recognized what they were seeing in their examination of the carbon atom structure was so consistent with what they had seen in Bucky's geodesic domes that they recognized that they were seeing what he had already identified. And
so for people who don't know, and there are many, I'm sure, what is a buckyball?
Well, then I get into trouble again. It's the carbon. Oh goodness! It's a manifestation of the carbon atom, and you will hear of it more and more now as nanotechnology is out, or nano research is out there. It's the fundamental principle that is opening up this whole nano world, which again, don't ask me to explain that, but it's a word and an idea that is going to affect our lives more and more. And again, it comes back, and it's exciting that it is the carbon atom that we're talking about, because another of Bucky's themes we're doing more and more with less and less. And nanotechnology is talking about doing incredible. The strength of nanostructures is unbelievable with these atoms, so it's definitely doing more and more with less and less.
Okay, we're going to close this half hour, and Allegra has agreed that we're going to go on a little bit more. So let me tell people that Bucky's books include Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, No More Secondhand God, Critical Path. The website is www.bfi.org. Thank you to Maggie LePeak, my engineer, Mark Maxwell and Stan Mizrahi in production, and Matt Perez in traffic. And to you, my listeners, I look forward to being with you again next week. Questions, comments, guests, issues you'd like to hear. If you're interested in CDs or transcripts of past shows, or you want to be on my email announce list that I send out weekly, email me at temcnally, one word, temcnally, at att.net. You've been listening to Freeform with Terry McNally. Thank you, Allegra Fuller-Snyder. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Terrence McNally. In the second half, you're going to hear my 2008 conversation with MacArthur Award-winning evolutionary biologist Stuart Kaufman about his book Reinventing the Sacred, a New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. And he suggests that the universe's ceaseless creativity may be the best way for us to think about God. And you can learn more at StuartKaufFman.com. Hello and welcome to Free Forum. I'm Terry McNally. I wrote something in January 2005, reflecting on the 2004 election, in which I felt the deciding factor may well have been the significant percentage of Bush voters who were misinformed about whether or not we'd found WMD in Iraq or Saddam had been involved with al-Qaeda or 9/11. I drew a bigger lesson from this triumph of ignorance. This is what I wrote. Quote, "For a system or an organism to thrive and evolve, intelligence should offer guidance and direction. With unprecedented technological power, humanity now more than ever needs intelligent direction. Yet intelligence is not in the driver's seat, at least not in America, still the world's most powerful entity. It is underperforming and under siege. Losing out to ignorance, greed, ideology, cleverness is not an option. The stakes are too high, whether in war, terror, or environmental catastrophe. Now, it strikes me that intelligence has been defined by so many as just cognitive, brainiac intelligence, and that we need to create a more robust definition that includes emotional, physical, spiritual, intuitive intelligence, so that intelligence can connect with and engage the greater society. So then I started seeking out guests with something to say about these and related issues, such as the roles of religion and science in society. I even came up with a book title for a collection of such interviews, Wrestling with Religion and Reality. In preparing to interview today's guest, Stuart Kauffman, I got truly excited that in his thinking and in his new book, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion, he has pulled together some very big ideas that go a long way to making sense of the largest dilemmas we face, and that he envisions a way forward that might restore our chances for success. Here on Freeforum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Stuart Kauffman is the director of the Institute for Biocomplexity and Informatics at the University of Calgary. He's a MacArthur Fellow and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. He's the author of The Origins of Order, At Home in the Universe, The Search for Laws of Self-Organization, Investigations, and his newest, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. Welcome, Stuart Kauffman, to KPFK and Freeforum.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas. So, you were originally a medical doctor. Your primary work has been as a theoretical biologist studying the origin of life, molecular organization. You've also applied the science of complexity to business management. And then in your newest book, you take on the biggest questions of religion and science. Could you briefly talk about your path to the work that you're doing today?
Well, yes, I can. I came into science profoundly interested in how a fertilized egg grows into an adult. And the problem is called cell differentiation, and how 30,000 genes turn one another on and off to make the different cell types in your body. So I've worked on that. I've worked on the origin of life. I hold founding patents in what is now called combinatorial chemistry. I've started 4 companies. I lived in one of them. And I've had fun being a scientist. So this has led me to investigations, which in turn led to reinventing the sacred. And maybe you have to get antique, or at least older. I'm now 68 and 2/3 plus or minus a little bit. So this is the over 65 set. And part of what's driving me, Terry, is the following set of things. A global civilization of some form is emerging. We don't know whether it'll be homogeneous or forever heterogeneous, but it's driven by global commerce. It's driven by global communication. People, in response to it, are in part retreating into fundamentalisms that are often religious and often hostile. Meanwhile, we confront peak oil, that year when we will get the most oil out of the ground that we will get, which may be about now, with catastrophic possible consequences for our global economy, with global warming, water shortages, resource wars, death, hunger, and we profoundly lack a global ethic that we can share across the planet. We lack a shared sense of the sacred that we can share across the planet. And I think we've got to find it. And my book, Reinventing the Sacred, is my best shot at it.
Mm-hmm. And in the first lines of your book, I'm going to read. The title of this book, Reinventing the Sacred, states its aim. I will present a new view of a fully natural God and of the sacred based on a new emerging scientific worldview. And then you say, this new worldview reaches further than science itself and invites this new view of God, the sacred, and ourselves, ultimately including our science, art, ethics, politics, and spirituality. Ambitious. What is that new worldview, and what is the worldview it's replacing?
Can we start with the second?
Yes.
Okay. It's the view that it is replacing with the cautionary note of a scientist that I may be wrong. Okay?
Excellent.
All scientists are taught to say that because otherwise you get in trouble. And I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. We'll see when we get to the crux spot if we get there. So it really comes from Descartes, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, Schrödinger, okay, and was best stated by a French mathematician, Simon Pierre Laplace, in Napoleon's time, who said, if there were a superb intelligence, not meaning God, just a superb intelligence, that knew the positions and the velocities and the masses of all the particles in the universe, then using Newton's laws, that intelligence could compute the entire future and the entire past of the universe. The past because Newton's laws are time reversible. Now, there are three aspects of this reductionistic worldview.
And let me just, for some people probably hearing that, there were a lot of things in that. One of them was, it was the location and velocity of all the particles in the universe.
All the particles.
Okay.
All the particles. Absolutely essential. Thanks, Terry. So there are three aspects to this reductionism. The first is that everything is deterministic. That is to say, if you start things the same way, the same things will happen. And that comes from Newton's laws, which are deterministic. Well, within a century, quantum mechanics call that into question with the famous Copenhagen interpretation and what's called the Born rule, where things are probabilistic, and Einstein was upset with God playing dice with the universe. The second, which is the broadest in our Western world view, is what I'm about to tell you. It is the view that everything that happens in the universe is describable by natural law. I think that's wrong. And that is the most startling thing I'm going to say. I think I'm correct. I think it requires examination. If I'm right, it changes huge tracts of our view of the world, because I'm going to wind up saying that part of what happens in the evolution of the biosphere, the economy, human culture, and maybe even the abiotic universe is not describable by law. Instead, there's an endless creativity.
And let me say again to people to emphasize some of the nuances here. A lot of people, it seems to me, in fact, I've interviewed many of them over the years because it's something I'm looking at, will point out the first problem in that worldview, which is that the reductionist thing, that everything that everything went according to Newton's laws. And then you say, well, what about quantum physics? What about relativity? And so that one's out there. But the second one
is absolutely new.
Is new.
It's absolutely new. It is the most radical thing I'm saying in a chapter called Breaking the Galilean Spell. I do confess that the title Breaking the Galilean Spell came to me while I was taking a bath. And I thought it was too good to ignore, so I used it.
And let me tell you, by the way, the voice that you hear is Stuart Kaufman. He's the director of the Institute for Biocomplexity and Informatics at University of Calgary. And his most recent book is what we're talking about, Reinventing the Sacred, A New View of Science, Reason, and Religion. I'm Terry McNally, and if you want to learn more, in addition to the book, Resurrecting the Sacred, you could go to the edge.org, edge.org, and then look for this article, put in this article, Breaking the Galileo Spell. Galilean Spell. Okay, so Galileo and everyone since has basically said we can explain things through natural laws. Stuart Kaufman says not so.
Correct. And we can go straight to it, Terry, if you want to. And I will ask the question of the audience that's listening that I've asked of everybody. But it takes about 2 to 3 minutes to say this.
Okay.
So suppose we went to Mr. Darwin and said, Darwin, what's the function of the heart? Say the human heart. Well, he would say it's to pump blood. And then we might say, but it makes heart sounds. And he would say, yes, but that's not the function of the heart. The heart was selected to pump blood. And basically, he's right. Okay, so there's a whole discussion there to be had, because you see, when Darwin says the function of the heart's to pump blood, he discriminates between that which has been selected and that which hasn't. And the physicist can't do that. The physicist can talk about what is, but not a subset of the causal consequences of what is, namely pumping blood as opposed to making heart sounds. And that's part of the argument that biology is emergent with respect to physics.
Okay,
that's not the main point I want to make.
I know, but let me get into that one just for a second so people are with us. You said pumping blood, everyone thinks, okay, that's what the heart's for. Then you say heart sounds. When you select that, heart sounds, you just mean something else that the heart does, or something else that happens if it's a heart.
Correct.
But not the thing that we seem to focus on.
Exactly so.
Okay.
Another example is that when your heart pumps blood, water in your pericardial sac that holds the heart wiggles. Well, that isn't the function of the heart either.
It's not about wiggling.
It's not about wiggling.
Okay.
Jiggling would be more scientific. So here was Darwin's next wonderful idea. He said, you know what? I bet there are properties of, say, organs, like hearts, of no use whatsoever in the current environment, like jiggling water in the pericardial sac or making heart sounds, that might turn out to be useful in some quite different selective environment. So that's called now a Darwinian pre-adaptation, and famous Stephen Jay Gould called them exaptations, but it's the same idea. There's
pre-adaptation, something that existed and was an adaptation to an environment that organism or organ wasn't in at the time.
That's correct. And there is no notion in the phrase pre-adaptation of a designer, creator, God, intelligent design, or anything. It's just there. Okay. Now, I'm going to give a couple of examples. The first I'm going to talk about is something called a swim bladder. Some fish have an organ called a swim bladder. It's partially filled with air, partially filled with water. The amount of water in the swim bladder adjusts neutral buoyancy in the water column and keeps the fish turned upright. Okay? Here's how paleontologists believe that the swim bladder arose. So there are fish that have lungs. They're called lungfish. The thought is that water got into the lungs of the lungfish. Now you have a sac with air and water in it. It's on its way to becoming a swim bladder. Okay? So that's a Darwinian pre-adaptation. Now I'm going to ask some essential questions about it. First, did a new function come to exist in the biosphere, adjusting neutral buoyancy in the water column? Well, I think we'd both agree that the answer is obviously yes. Second, did it have an effect on the evolution of the biosphere? Sure, new species, new proteins, new molecules, so it had causal consequences. Now's my big question. I'm going to ask you, Terry.
Okay.
Ready? Do you think, honestly, that you could say ahead of time all possible Darwinian pre-adaptations for all organisms, or, say, just for human beings?
No. In other words, you're saying, could I sit here now and tell you everything that is a descriptor or a function or something within us that we aren't using yet? Is that what you're saying?
That might turn out.
No, of course not, because what that stuff is difficult to see because of where we stand and where I look at this moment.
That's exactly right.
Now, so you're saying that the fact that we can't predict all of those is important?
It's good. Watch what happens. Now, it turns out that I've talked by now to thousands of people. We all say the same thing. We all say, nope, we cannot say ahead of time what Darwinian pre-adaptations are going to be in the biosphere, and it'll turn out in the economy and in human culture too. So we'll get there in a moment. Now, watch what happens. First of all, could we do what Newton told us to do? So here's what Newton told us to do about a billiard table. He said, look, here's a billiard table. It's got billiard balls on it. Name the variables, or the billiard balls, and their positions and velocities and masses. Now name the laws among these variables. I just happened to write them down. Here's my 3 laws of motion. Now look at the boundary conditions, the edges of the billiard table. Now compute. Just go ahead. I invented the calculus. Compute what's going to happen, and lo and behold, you can compute what's going to happen. So that's Newton. Now let's ask, can we do that for the biosphere? Can we write down the variables such that we can talk about the evolution of the biosphere from before until after swim bladders come into existence?
Right. In other words, what both Newton and Laplace said, which was that if you know those mathematical pieces of information about the particles in the universe, you should be able to predict whatever's going to ever happen in the biosphere. And as you say, not just the biosphere, in human culture. And then you actually focus on human economy, which I think to some people will be one of the more interesting things. You pick up a book that seems to be a scientist talking about science and religion. Okay, that's a lot already. But you actually do put the human economy as a critical example, a world kind of worth studying that to you is another one of these exceptions to those predictive rules of these natural laws.
It is absolutely. And can we get there in a sec?
Yeah.
So let's just sort of stay where we are for a moment. So can we write down the Newtonian trick and do it for the biosphere? And the answer is no, because we do not know ahead of time the variables that are going to come into existence. We don't know the billiard balls. We don't know swim bladders, lungs, livers, noses, your middle ear bones, which evolved from 3 adjacent bones in an early fish. We don't know, so we can't do it. So we can't do what Newton said. By the way, let me go back to part of why you said no, and we all do. One of them is, how would we say ahead of time what all selective environments are?
Right.
It seems impossible.
Yeah.
The second thing is, let's come back to the jaw bones. 3 adjacent jaw bones in an early fish became 3 adjacent bones in your middle ear, the incus malleus and stapes, that help you hear. Had one of those bones been in the skull, one in the spine, and one in the jaw, would we have gotten the same thing in the middle ear? Almost certainly not. That means the spatial relations among those jaw bones mattered. So let's use the physicist's phrase, relational degrees of freedom. Do we have any way whatsoever to specify ahead of time the relationships among things within or between organisms that might turn out to be pre-adaptations in environments that we can't state? And the answer seems to be obviously no.
I'm going to say we've got about 9 minutes more. And so I want us to move a little bit more into the implications of this rather than laying out the whole thing. If I had an hour or two,
the whole thing.
We'd do the whole thing.
But look, Terry, let me get one sentence beyond.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Most people think a natural law is a compact description of the regularities of a process, like Newton's laws, or like Einstein's laws, or like Schrodinger's equation from quantum mechanics. Do you think we could have a law, a natural law, for the emergence of swim bladders? Well, the answer seems to be obviously no. We can't even prestate the possibility. How could we have a law? Okay? That means something stunning. It means, if this is right, that contrary to what Laplace thought, Descartes thought, Galileo thought, Newton thought, and Einstein thought, what happens in the unfolding of the universe, at least the biosphere, maybe the whole universe, is partially beyond natural law. And it's from that the well springs flow, because it means a lot.
Well, let me just say one of the things that I take it to mean, and tell me if I'm right, because I was explaining to someone earlier today. I'm going to go interview this guy, and this is kind of what he says, and I tried to, is that once life emerges, once there's something you call agency.
Yep.
And agency has something to do with will. It has something to do with choice. And once that emerges, then all that stuff that applied to pool balls billiard balls doesn't apply anymore. And one of the key things you say is the thing we were just talking about. You cannot predict all of that. And,
That's right.
and the fact that there is agency, that there is choice, that there is and choice, I don't mean to say conscious choice, right? In other words, life has an agency that still defies prediction.
That's right. We cannot predict how the biosphere is going to evolve. We just can't.
And why is that so critical? And what are the implications of that?
Well, the same thing's true in the economy. So I don't have time to tell you the
Right.
story of the invention of the tractor, but it involves a similar.
Well, let me see if I can do it quickly again, because
Okay.
I tried to figure it out. Basically, the tractor had an engine case, right?
Yep.
That was too heavy for the ways they thought of putting it together.
Well, they were trying to put it on a chassis that would hold it, and it kept breaking chassis.
Right.
And finally, one of the engineers said, you know what? The engine block is so big and rigid, we can use the engine block itself as the chassis and hang everything off the engine block. And that's how tractors are made.
Right.
That's a Darwinian pre-adaptation. It's a
The
causal...
rigidity and weight of the chassis, which looked like a problem, actually was an opportunity.
Of the engine block.
Right.
Right. And in fact, most inventions are used for purposes besides that for which they were invented. For example, when the computer was invented, nobody foresaw Facebook, right? I pick Facebook because it's the height of Western civilization. So what this means is that the same thing is true for the evolution of our economy and culture. It's not describable entirely by natural law. That means...
And one of the ways that you say, one of the key things there that I get from that is, how do you know something cannot be explained by natural law is if you cannot predict it from what you know right now.
Right. Okay. Now, let's look at consequence number one. The highest virtue, human virtue of the Enlightenment that we all love is reason. But what I just told you is we really don't know. In fact, I just talked to Jan Rivkin, who's in charge of teaching strategy at Harvard Business School, and he said, you know what? We have no methodology whatsoever. We just give them a lot of hard problems and hope they get good at it. And business people are precisely people who are trying to figure out what to do in a world when they don't know. That means that reason, our beloved reason, is an insufficient guide for living our lives. We need emotion, we need intuition, we need metaphor, we need story, we need whatever we can bring to bear that we've evolved over the last 3 billion years to manage to live our lives. I think, Terry, this means something enormous. It means that we have to re-understand our integrated humanity. We don't understand it. And that's why I say at the beginning of the book, this goes way beyond science. It involves art, politics, plumbing, the law, radio interviews,
and if I may,
everything.
it goes to that thing that I said at the top, doesn't
Absolutely.
it? In other words, that's
Absolutely.
why when I read, when I started reading your stuff, I got so excited, which is that if, as I've seen happen in American society, if intelligence is just rationality,
It's insufficient.
then it's easy to attack.
Right.
And what ends up happening is we then throw out the baby with the bathwater with people who sort of turn their back on rationality. What you're saying is that's because it isn't all that's going on. It isn't
Right.
all that we have at our resource, with or without the words of a holy book or not.
That's right. So we have to re-understand and reintegrate our entire humanity. I truthfully believe we need a new enlightenment because, and then I want to get to God.
Very good.
But let me say this about the Enlightenment, or a new enlightenment. We have to understand, if what we've said is correct, Terry, about partial lawlessness, then the view that we've had in the West is about reductionism and explaining everything is wrong. We have to understand what it is to be human in a world where in part we have laws, but in part we don't have it and we don't know. What does it mean to be fully human and make our way? So that's a huge topic, and it's going to take a long time to understand it. Now, if I may, let me turn to God. How many gods have we worshipped in the last 100,000 years? Lots.
Many.
At least 7. Okay. Have our ideas about our Abrahamic God changed in the last 4,500 years? Well, Yahweh was a tough God. He was a warrior, law-giving God, and
the New Testament, the God of love, the God of compassion and mercy.
The New Testament is a God of love. I think God is a symbol that humanity has invented, and I think it is our choice whether or not we wish to use that symbol in a new way and reinvent God. And here's what I think we should think about. In place of law, in the becoming of the biosphere and human civilization, and maybe the whole universe, there is an incredible and ceaseless creativity. Let's distinguish between the Creator God and the creativity of that God. Do we need the Creator God anymore? I say we don't. We need the creativity. And we've got the creativity. It's here in this boundless creativity. We are children of this creativity. I'm going to tell one personal story that I think brings it home. I was sitting in my house up in Canada, and there's a hillside and a river right next to us. The hillside is covered with spruce and fir. And I looked at the spruce and fir, and I said, I could cut that down if I wanted to. But in my sense of God, that spruce and fir forest is God's work. How dare I? I'd better have a very good reason. Then I looked at the river, and I said, I could dam that river if I wanted to. But that's God's work. I'd better have a very good reason. You see, I think this view of God invites a sense of the sacred. The sacred becomes all of life on the planet.
Including us. Including
us.
That sits there and considers cutting down that forest or damming that
Become
river.
part of the sacred.
You, in your creative response to the question you yourself raised, then your perception, and then your feeling, and then your resonance, and then your emotion, and then all of those things that went into that moment, that is part of the creativity, and that is God.
That's right. In this view, we are not made in God's image. We too are God. But so is the worm, the butterfly, the tree, and the planet.
And that God is the endless, boundless, continuous creativity of existence, or of life.
Of existence and of the natural world. So then the hope is we can get from a sense of the sacred to a global ethic that can guide us in the face of peak oil, water resources being limited, global warming, a global civilization. We have to do it, Terry. We're killing one another.
That's right. Our creativity is what has created the problems that we face.
Exactly.
In other words, it was our creativity that discovered the value of oil. It was our creativity that created the internet. It was our creativity that found the value of hygiene and thus led to enormous populations. And it is our creativity that must get us out of this, and that's the role of God. I got to wrap it up. The book is Reinventing the Sacred, a new view of science, reason, and religion. You can learn more by going to theedge.org, edge.org, and then looking for Stuart Kaufman, Kauffman, or his particular essay, Breaking the Galilean Spell. Thank you, Stuart Kaufman. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.